Mass layoffs at the FDA are causing major delays in drug development as biotech companies face setbacks in clinical trials and approvals, ultimately slowing the delivery of new treatments to patients. Joining us right now is Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner and a CNBC contributor. He's also a Pfizer and Illumina board member. And Doctor, thank you for being with us this morning. Is it your understanding, these were reports that we had been reading last week, that things are slowing down because of staff layoffs? You think that's the case?
Well, look, what we're seeing, if you talk to biotech companies, what you're seeing is they're not getting the same level of interaction with the agency that they previously expected. So companies that are asking for meetings or asking for teleconferences with the agencies are getting written responses only, WROs. That's not good for small biotech companies that need that engagement with the agency, that have complex development pathways or not as much experience. And that's starting to impact development programs. You're hearing that refrain from biotech companies. It's hard to measure right now because it's happening in real time. But if you look at the first quarter, there were only 9 drug approvals by the FDA. That's an all-time, that's a low since the COVID lows of 2022. Now, there's about 75 drugs that are slated for approval this year. So it's a rich pipeline this year, and it could be a record. But so far, you're seeing the agency fall behind on some of that work. Finally, look, there's a lot of resiliency built into the agency. So I think that they're going to find ways to try to work more efficiently. And again, by not having the meetings and as much engagement, focusing more on the review activities. But there's 2 things on the horizon I think really tip the balance here. There's about 600 people, about 25% of the review staff is currently recused, according to what I'm hearing off the agency. These are people who are looking. Recused? They're looking to leave the agency. So there's an expectation that there's going to be a lot of voluntary departures from the agency over the course of the summer. The other thing is that the leadership's pushing a reorganization plan that would consolidate all the medical product and scientific centers into one big review function. So the Office of Medical Devices, the Office of Biologics, the Office of Drugs, the Office of Tobacco Products, the Office of Veterinary Medicine would all be consolidated into one single center as a way to try to reduce headcount. I think that will have a very dramatic impact on the agency if they go forward with that.
Did you say traumatic or dramatic?
Dramatic and traumatic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't love bureaucracy. You don't like to see the repeating of similar instances, of the similar functions being repeated. But in this case, I think it's a pretty unique and necessary function. It's very different to get approval for any of these different things. And as you were pointing out, for a small company, for a biologic in particular, you need guidance on what the agency will accept and what they won't, so that you do your trials properly in a way that the FDA wants to see that data put out.
That's right. And look, the reorganization plan, so they're looking to separate things like the compliance function from the scientific review function, thinking that if they just consolidate these things in separate centers, they can reduce headcount along each function. There's very good reasons why you want the compliance function, for example, closely integrated with the scientific review staff, because the scientific review staff understands the sort of nature of a problem that arises in a post-market setting, say a drug side effect, and they can direct the compliance function to take appropriate action. So you don't want to separate those 2 scientific functions. It might look like redundancies to have a compliance and a review team within each center.
I mean, this is a situation where a little extra headcount, I think, cuts down on the bureaucratic red tape and the bureaucratic red tape that would cause these companies to have to go back and reapply and reapply and reapply. And I think some small companies would never get through the process that way.
Yeah, look, it makes, I think, the review function more efficient.
Yeah.
Moving on from the new drug approval process, the biggest impact of the recent reductions is going to be on generic drugs. They eliminated the office that wrote all the guidance documents to lay out the pathway for first-in-class generics to be approved. So this is an office that basically, when a new generic gets approved, a complex formulation, so when we approved EpiPen, a generic EpiPen, for example, we had to lay out in guidance how we intended to do that, what the scientific parameters were that we were going to use to evaluate that generic drug. And you have to do that for every new generic drug that gets approved. They eliminated the entire group. So
You were the head of the FDA in the last Trump administration. Has anybody asked you about any of these things? Have you offered your opinions and advice to what they're doing there?
Well, these things are happening very quickly. So DOJ, from my understanding, DOJ is prescribing the level of headcount reductions that they want to achieve. And then the leadership of the different agencies is actually implementing the plan to achieve that. So DOJ isn't actually directing that this office should be eliminated or this office should be eliminated. Now, the office I'm talking about within generic drugs had a policy in its title. So the presumption is that they eliminated any office that had policy in its title, thinking it was redundant. Now, maybe it was misnamed, but it wasn't a policy office. It was a review function office. I don't know how they're going to approve new generic drugs, first-in-class generic drugs, without the function of that office. That office has developed 3,000 product-specific guidances delineating the pathway for the approval of new generic drugs. And this was a singular achievement of the first Trump administration. We had approved 970 generic drugs in 2018, a record, and then beat that record the following year with 1,170 approvals. And the president actually touted it in the State of the Union address. So this was something the administration was very focused on. Now, I believe the White House doesn't know that this office was eliminated and what the implication is going to be. They're not dealing at that level. But this will have profound implications on access to generics.
Because it gets generic drugs, cheaper drugs to into Americans' homes and
That's right.
their abilities to bring down costs.
Right. Over one 18-month period, we did an economic analysis to get it into the president's State of the Union address. And so we estimated that there were $26 billion in savings between 2018 and 2019 from all the generic approvals that were happening. And this office actually was created or was grown during the Trump administration with this explicit purpose, the first Trump administration, and they've eliminated it. So I think there's impacts on the new drug side, but the impacts on the generic drug approval process may be far more profound.
What happened at United Healthcare last week? What the hell was that?
With respect to the...
Down 100 points, the stock. What did they say that was... Why was it such a shocker in terms of utilization?
Well, look, I think there was, I'm not a United Healthcare analyst, but it looked like they missed across the board in the different business units. But
the main
big thing was medical, right? So they miscalculated, right? So Medicare patients were seeking more care than what they had estimated. There's still maybe some...
Were they doing it on purpose, or are they being told to seek more care by the Medicare Advantage? There's supposedly... You can game those Medicare Advantage if you run one of those operations.
Yeah, look, I haven't dug into it. My hunch is they just miscalculated what utilization would be, because utilization's been up across the board in multiple companies. I think United Healthcare probably didn't estimate appropriately the rise in utilization that we're seeing in the healthcare space. But I haven't looked deeply into it.
It was like 800 Dow points. Because it was
it's a lot.
7 times whatever it was. That day we were up 350 points. United Healthcare reported we were down 400 in the next instant. Bizarre. Okay, so you have nothing. It wasn't that
I don't have anything.
It wasn't the bad PR. It wasn't.
I don't have anything you haven't heard.
It wasn't that they've been pressured to cover more because of the bad PR.
To say no to fewer things.
Right.
To people who are actually coming with claims that should have been covered.
Exactly.
Potentially.
Look, they're under scrutiny and they're being more careful, but it looked like the miss was on miscalculated utilization.